Okay, welcome to live stream some number, 4 or 5, not sure which one. Um, Today we are going to be talking about a lot of Mac malware. We're going to start with kind of a overview of the Mac malware from 2018. So I wrote a blog about all the samples, the new samples that we saw in the wild. So we're going to kind of go through those. Okay, bye puppy. You come back and say hi later. And then we're going to look at Windtail. We briefly looked at this during the last live stream. It's a piece of malware used by nation state to attack a certain Middle Eastern government. So rather interesting Mac backdoor. We talked about the persistence techniques last time. Today we are going to dive into its capabilities and its installation vectors. So I want to start by thanking, as always, the friends of Objective-C. You can see them listed on the screen. First and foremost, Digita Security, my main employer. Very thankful for their continuing support and also putting up with my continuing shenanigans. Sophos, we have a new friend, MacPaw. They create the popular unarchived utility as well as some other Mac utilities. So very thankful to them for joining the program. Also Malwarebytes, SmugMug Flickr, the Guardian mobile firewall, and last but definitely not least, the Secure Mac. So again, mahalo to those sponsors. So as I mentioned, let's start by looking at some, or rather the Mac malware samples of 2018. And like I said, this is in blog form. Let me just post the blog here. So feel free to read along. There's also a PDF version of this. I'll post the link for that if you want to download it and read that. But basically what I do every year, kind of at the end of the year, so in December or between Christmas and New Year's, I put together what I hope is a comprehensive blog post of all the new Mac malware samples from the year. So this one would obviously be the ones from 2018. And my goal is for each of those to identify the samples, talk about the infection vector, that is how they get onto end user systems, how they infect Mac users, talk about their persistence techniques, that is how they install themselves once they gain execution on a Mac computer, and then identify what the goal or the capabilities of the malware is. For example, is it to display ads? Is it to give remote access to an adversary? Is it to mine cryptocurrency, et cetera, et cetera? So here's a brief timeline, and then we'll kind of go through each of the samples, briefly talking about them. So again, this is hopefully kind of the one-stop shop if you're interested in the Mac malware from the previous year. So first we have Mommy. This was at the beginning of 2018. And this was, as we can see, a DNS hijacker basically trying to intercept traffic so that it could inject ads or redirect search results. Following that, in February, we had something called Crossrat. This was a cross-platform cyber espionage backdoor that gave attackers remote access. And I'm actually not going to read all these because we're going to talk about these individually. So we had Creative Updater, Coldroot, PP Miner, Dummy, Callisto, Apple Juice, Windtail, Evil Egg, Fairytale, Darth Minor, and Lanefire. So again, those kind of are the Mac malware of 2018. So now let's look at each of the specimens, each of the samples in detail. So I want to mention that for each of these samples, I have provided a download link. So if you want to actually download the specimen, you can do that. There's each individual link, or actually if you go to Objective-C and just go to the malware page, this is a sample, a collection of all publicly available Mac malware. And if I'm missing any samples, please let me know. My goal, though, is to make these available to researchers. So if you want to download and play along with these samples, you can. So for example, if we want Mommy, we can just search for Mommy, and then you can click download. The password for all these files is infected with a 3 instead of an E. Obviously, they have to be password protected. Otherwise, my hosting provider will flag them as malware, or Google Chrome won't allow you to download them. And yes, as Josh said, sharing is caring. When I started doing malware analysis, it was actually often difficult to get Mac malware samples because a lot of the AV companies, don't want to just willy-nilly share samples. But I've kind of built some relationships with them, and so I'm often able to get access to these samples. I think they should be readily available online. Obviously, they're available to the bad guys, so I think having a collection where they're available to the good guys is helpful as well. So now let's briefly talk through some of the samples from 2019. So first we have Mommy. This is actually a sample that I got to name. I was super stoked. I always wanted to name a piece of Mac malware. So I was like, check bucket list kind of thing. So you can see we have some write-ups, links to more information. So again, if you're really interested in a specific sample, look under the write-up section. This probably actually links to my blog write-up because I was the first one to write about this specific malware. So we can see, though, infection vector, we can see it's a browser pop-up with user interaction. This basically means that if a user or a Mac user is browsing the web page, there will be a pop-up and something saying like, hey, you need to install this Flash update or your computer is infected. Obviously, it's not, but then basically get the user to download and infect the system. You can see, as the user mentioned here, this was a lame method of transmission. Basically, it said a pop-up came up that the victim clicked and followed through with, meaning the victim basically had to infect themselves. So there's a question from GamerBot saying, why do you call it Mommy? And that is a great question. I believe the reason I call it Mommy is because there is an embedded string in the binary. So if we look here, this is in the blog where I detail this malware, there's actually a class called SM Mommy Settings. So I saw that embedded in there. I said, okay, hey, this seems like a good name for the malware. The binary is not named Mommy. I name it Mommy. But again, it has these class methods, for example, init Mommy Settings. I don't know what Mommy stands for, but it just seemed like something it could, a good name for this piece of malware. So again, in order to infect a system, this adware relied on user interaction. So kind of a lame method. Hopefully none of you listening would fall for such a technique. In terms of persistence, it persists as a launch daemon. What persistence means is a way for the malware to install itself so that every time the system is rebooted, the operating system would automatically restart the malware. Persistence is something important because if malware doesn't obtain persistence and you reboot your Mac, it's not going to get executed again, unless you get tricked into executing it again. So basically all malware does, once it gains execution on your system, it installs itself persistently. And then from then on, it doesn't have to worry because it knows every time the system is rebooted, it will get automatically launched by the operating system. And there's a variety of ways to do this on Mac OS, and we'll see some of these abused by malware mentioned in this blog. So for example, there's launch daemons, there's launch agents, there are login items. You can Google or read my other blogs, which kind of go into more details about these. But again, the takeaway is it's just a method where the malware can install itself. So when the system is rebooted, the operating system will automatically relaunch the malware so it can continue running. So we can see in the strings or if we actually in a debugger dump some of the information about Mommy, we can see there is what looks like a plist file, a property list file for persistence. And this is probably the most important thing right here. We can see run at load set to true. So when you install a property list file and you set this key run at load to true, this tells the operating system, please execute me. Cool. So again, this is how Mommy persists. We have a nice post from Intego. We are actually honored to have Josh, who I believe is the author of this post, in the chat. So again, Intego and specifically Josh posts a lot of really interesting blogs about Mac malware. So definitely check out his work as well. So I'm just going to actually post this. Again, kudos to Josh. Kudos to, I can't spell, man. Awesome. Okay, Now, in terms of its capability, it's a DNS hijacker, meaning it's going to redirect traffic. And what it does is it first installs a malicious certificate. And this is so it can basically redirect and modify even HTTPS or SSL traffic. So once this is in the system root, it's set to be trusted. So again, this means it can modify even secure traffic. It then modifies the preferences.plist file. And what it does is it changes the DNS servers to these two IP addresses. So if you run the malware on a VM, you can actually see when you go and look at your DNS settings that it has been set to point to these two malicious DNS servers. What this means is anytime you resolve a domain, for example, google.com, these DNS servers can give you any address at once and tell you to go to another domain. For example, to control your search results, inject ads. Again, this is how cyber criminals can make money. Redirecting search results, injecting ads, etc., etc. There's one interesting point. This actually looks like this might be a fully rewritten version of a Windows piece of malware called DNS Unlocker. And we notice that because the thumbprint on the certificate, which was installed here on the Mac, matches the thumbprint of a certificate that was found in a Windows piece of malware that also hijacked that. And this was brought to my attention by Noor from Space, who's again another really good Mac security researcher. So again, just post this tweet. If you guys are interested in Mac malware, I would recommend following him. He does a lot of awesome work. So it's likely that the attackers had a piece of Windows malware and then they ported that to Mac because they say, oh, look, there's lots of Macs out there. Be cool if I could infect these systems. So we see that happen often where attackers or hackers who have a working piece of Windows malware, will port that and rewrite that so it runs on Mac and then start targeting Mac users just to increase their targets and increase the amount of money they're making by infecting new people. Next up, we have Crossrat. Crossrat is interesting because it is cross-platform as it's written in Java. And unlike Mommy, which was a piece of adware, this is rather a cyber espionage backdoor, let's say. So it was designed likely by or for a nation state to target specific individuals to give an attacker continuing access to an infected system. So again, link to download it. There's some write-ups. Again, this was initially detected or written up by EFF, the Electronic Foundation. What are they? EFF? EFF.org. I should know this. Yeah, Electronic Frontier Foundation. They do things like if certain human rights activists are targeted by nation states, they work with them to uncover the malware and analyze that. So they did some initial analysis. Their research, while really awesome, really didn't dive into the Mac-specific components of Crossrat. So I saw it as an opportunity to kind of continue and provide some more technical detail. So the infection vector, likely phishing. This means the target would likely get a malicious email with maybe a links or something to click on. Also, it's important to know that Crossrat is written in Java, and most recent versions of Mac OS don't actually have Java. So this means most Mac users actually are not going to be vulnerable to this threat. But of course, if Java is already installed on the system, or the malware somehow convinces the users to install Java, they then would become infected. So in terms of persistence, this uses a launch agent, which again is similar to a launch daemon. And we can see by looking at the decompiled Java, specifically the B/C class in the B module, we can see the code for this. So we can see them building a property list that they will set or install on the system that will point to their malware. This again instructs the operating system to launch whatever they specify, which will be a path to their malware. We can see they set the run at load key to true, meaning that the operating system will launch this automatically. So we run this on a VM, we can actually see the malware install itself, we can dump the property list, and we can see what they do is they execute a copy of themselves, they persist themselves, and run it load is set to true, so this guarantees persistence. If you're running a tool like block, it will detect this activity because what it does is it monitors these persistence locations to basically say, hey, something is persisting. So even though block never saw this piece of malware before, it was generically able to detect this with no a priori knowledge. Just put a link to that if you're interested in block. Again, one of the utilities I write that's designed to detect malware persistence. In terms of its capabilities, I mentioned it's a backdoor. It's a fairly standard backdoor, but it does provide the adversary with this decent number of capabilities. So the first thing it does is persists, and it then checks in with the command and control server, which is flexberry.com. And we can see that this is embedded in the K class, both the port and the address of the command and control server. What it then does is it connects to that command and control server and basically says, hey, do you have any tasking for me? So this allows the remote attackers to specify an action that they would like the malware to take. And we can see some of the commands that the malware supports. Specifically, we can see that if the server returns, for example, a 1, this is the command to tell it to enumerate files on the system. 2 tells it to create a blank file. 3 is copy a file. 4 is move file, etc., etc. Command number 8 is interesting. It'll take a screenshot. And command number 9 will either run a DLL, because again, this is cross-platform, so it runs on Windows, or it will execute a specified binary. So again, here we can see the logic where the malware is connecting to the command and control server, and then it has this logic to process the response from the server. So we can see if the argument is equal to kn, n was the string 1, it's going to execute the logic to enumerate files. So again, pretty standard logic. So again, that was cross-rat. I guess the important takeaways are it's cross-platform, and it's designed again to give an attacker access to files and take screenshots, which are more cyber espionage type activities, right? This is not malware. This is not interested in making money. This is more interested in basically spying on targets. Next, we have Creative Update. In a nutshell, Creative Update is a crypto miner that was distributed via Trojan applications hosted on the popular MacUpdate.com website. Again, you can download the sample here or from the Mac Malware collection. In terms of write-ups, there's a few links. I actually wrote a link that goes into details on this as well, so feel free to check that out. Again, kudos to Nor from Space, bringing this to my attention. The infection vector is probably the most interesting thing about this. And as Thomas Reed notes, Thomas Reed works for Malwarebytes, another prolific Mac security researcher, mad respect to him. He basically specifies that it's being distributed via the MacUpdate.com website. So MacUpdate.com is actually a legit website that distributes Mac applications. Problem is they keep getting hacked, or somehow rather, I shouldn't say they get hacked, malicious adversaries are able to upload infected binaries disguised, for example, as Firefox. So I think I have a screenshot here, yes. So we can see that this binary, Firefox, was uploaded to the Mac Update website. But we can see, though, that the binary, or rather the disk image, was not signed by Mozilla. Rather, it's signed by some random developer ID, Ramos Jackson, with an X. Trendy. So here's a screenshot of a slide that kind of describes this a little more detail. There was an alert from the Mac Update editors or admins basically saying, hey, some of the files we're hosting are actually malicious. Josh says, in this case, an editor was tricked into publishing a bad download URL. Okay, so that clarifies the situation. Thank you, Josh. So instead of them actually uploading the binary to the Mac Update site, they basically likely coerced an editor to publish a bad link. So if someone would look for Firefox on the Mac Update site, instead of getting Mozilla's Firefox, they would get this malicious copy. So since it was signed, Gatekeeper would not block it. Again, this is this website where users are downloading software, so there's really no indication to the user that what they're downloading is malicious. So from the attacker's point of view, this is a great attack vector or infection vector because, again, it's essentially transparent to the users, and they're likely targeting a lot of Mac users. So when the malicious DMG, so Firefox or a few other popular applications that had been modified or the download links had been redirected, once they were downloaded and executed, if we look at the contents of the bundle, we can see there's something called script, which is just a script, and we can see exactly then what this malware does. Specifically, we can see it basically beacons out to this domain, unzips something called mdworker.zip, persists that, and then launches that. Pretty standard stuff. In terms of persistence, it's going to persist as a launch agent via the Mac OS update.plist. So on an infected system, we can dump this plist to see exactly what that's doing. So here it is. There's this plist file. We can see via the shell, it's basically unloading something called Mac OS plist, and then downloading something else from curl and installing that as a second launch agent. So it has a second persistent component. We can also then dump that second persistent component, and we can see it's going to persist something called mdworker that is executed via the shell. We can run a tool like knock knock and see this persistence capability. So pretty easy to detect. In terms of the capabilities for this malware, again, Nord from Space noted that this is a crypto miner, meaning it's going to mine cryptocurrencies on an infected system. And this is actually a trend we saw a lot of in 2018. I guess it was profitable for hackers to infect a large number of systems and then install a cryptocurrency miner and mine away using the user's spare CPU cycles. So if we look what they persisted, that second persistent binary, so this is always going to be running, they call it mdworker. It turns out that this is a legitimate copy of a command line crypto miner belonging to MinerGate called crypto minergate-CLI. So you can actually download this yourself, the miner, and install this on your system. The miner itself is not malicious. It's just being installed in an unauthorized manner in the case of when it's being abused by the malware. Now, if we go back to the plist, we can see that it was executed with a few command line parameters, specifically -user and then this user email, and then -xmr. XMR tells it to mine a certain type of cryptocurrency, specifically the mine Monero, which I guess is a popular cryptocurrency. I know nothing about cryptocurrency, but that's a thing. And then the email address tells the miner where to basically send the mined funds. So basically what this hacker was doing was pushing out this malware to as many Macs as he or she could, installing it persistently, and then mining. And all these miners would then mine cryptocurrencies and report them back to MinerGate's centralized hub and give credit to this email account. So again, from a purely non-ethical point of view, this is actually, it was likely a decent way to make a decent amount of money. All right, so next up we have Coldroot. Coldroot is another cross-platform persistent backdoor or RAT, remote administration tool. And the interesting thing about this is that it was written in Pascal. In terms of the infection vector, it's unknown. And it was actually unlikely that Coldroot was ever discovered in the wild. However, its creator likely was trying to sell it. So here's a capture from some discussion where the alleged author of this was basically saying, hey, I'm going to release this shortly, and this malware is going to be for sale. So again, I doubt it ever made it into the wild because I uncovered it before it, as far as I know, proliferated. Kind of funny story about how I detected it. I think it's in here. I basically was on VirusTotal looking for something else, and I noticed that there was this file called com.apple.audio.driver2 that was undetected. However, it was packed and contained interesting references to things that it shouldn't, and so it turned out to be malware. So just if something, good reminder, if something is not detected on VirusTotal doesn't mean it's necessarily benign. Persistence, cold root persisted as a launch daemon. We can see the logic for this in an aptly named function, install me. We can also see the embedded property list in the malware's binary. Again, if we look, I believe that run at load key is going to be set to true. Yeah, we can see right down here at the bottom of the screen. So this, as I mentioned, tells the operating system to persist this in a way to automatically execute it. And yes, tools like BlockBlock will detect when this malware persists on your system. So regardless of how it gets on an end user system, BlockBlock can, again, with no knowledge, no a priori knowledge, it can detect the persistent attempt. In terms of its capabilities, I notice rather feature complete, meaning it really allows a remote adversary to do a lot of things. For example, list files, delete files, list process, execute processes, download, upload, install a keylogger, and a lot more. We have a question regarding DNS hijacking. Is this a common initial objective of malware prior to achieving persistence? So Mommy, as we talked about earlier, hijacks DNS. And the question was, is this something common that malware often does? So in the case of Mommy, and this is actually a good point, once you hijack the DNS settings, you don't actually really need to persist if you don't want to. You basically change the settings, and as long as the user doesn't notice, which the average user is unlikely to notice that their DNS settings have been changed, the malware really doesn't have to remain on the system. Because again, the DNS redirection is going to tell all DNS requests to go to the attacker server. So on Windows, I think this is fairly common. As far as I know, though, on Mac, this is not something we see happen a lot. I'm not sure why. One reason is you have to first install a trusted root certificate, which I think requires the user to click through a bunch of prompts, so it's not really very stealthy. And also, I'm not sure what else I was going to say about that. But yes, it's not something we see a lot on Mac OS. So good question. If you guys have, and girls, have any questions, feel free to hop in and specify them. If I was going to write a piece of adware, DNS redirection is kind of a interesting technique, which is fairly stealthy and probably gives you access to a lot of interesting traffic remotely without having to necessarily persist a component. For the record, I don't write adware, but I'm just saying it's a interesting technique. Okay, so back to cold root. It has, for example, the embedded command and control server and port in a config file. And as I mentioned, most of the commands are very self-explanatory. For example, process list, they just enumerate the list of processes on the system so an attacker can see that. In terms of the screen sharing or remote desktop, it's actually implemented in a very interesting way. The attacker just takes screenshots very quickly and sends those out. So it's not actually like streaming video, it's basically quickly streaming screen captures. So this isn't always on, but it's maybe a low-tech, efficient way to do remote monitoring of the system. So it's not like you can actually interact like a traditional remote desktop, but you can basically watch what a user is doing by, again, continually taking screenshots and sending them out to the command and control server. Lastly, the keylogger is implemented as a core graphic event tap. If you were on the live stream, I believe it was a few weeks ago, or watched it on YouTube, we talked a lot about core graphic event taps, and we actually talked about this malware, basically describing how adversaries can abuse these API to capture keystrokes. With a core graphic event tap installed, anytime a user presses a key, this will get redirected to the local malware, which can log that. Here's an animated GIF of this in action. I think Josh was the one that pointed out last time that the malware actually has a bug in it that it'll miss the letter C. So you can see here when I log into my bank account, I type my name, which has a C into it, but the malware actually, for some reason, doesn't log that. But it does capture my password. So an interesting capability. All right. Next up, we have .sh layer or schlayer, I'm not sure on the pronunciation. This is distributed as a fake flash player. And again, all it does is install adware on an infected system. I'm going to kind of breeze through this because to me, this isn't super interesting. The user has to basically infect themselves by being tricked. Again, for the write-up on this Intego article, so again, kudos. I'm not sure if Josh wrote this or another Intego author. Josh, it is. Wow, Josh, number 2. Go follow Josh on Twitter. He does cool stuff. So again, a Mac user would come to a malicious website or a pop-up, and they're basically instructions to install this flash player. It's really not a flash player, it's just malware. A lot of Mac users will fall for this. Again, I hope none of you listening would. So again, heavily relies on user interaction, but this apparently is working because attackers keep generating this kind of malware. In terms of the persistence, all this fake flash player does is install a crap load of other Mac adware. Kind of the details of this, but we can see it kind of reaching out to these various adware-related APIs to install things. And again, the Intego report articulates what it installed, something called Mac offers, which is also known as bundle me up and adlore, and also bundlore. So again, these are the things that, when someone calls you and says, hey, my Mac is infected, you say, why is it infected? Oh, I get all these pop-ups and my search results are all being redirected. It's likely because they fell for this kind of attack. Next up, we have PP Miner. This is another cryptocurrency miner. Again, similar to the one we talked about, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The infection vector was never detected, but likely, as Thomas Reed notes, something that required user interaction. So again, something that users were perhaps clicking through. Persistence, use the launch daemon. We've seen this before many times. Run it load, set to true. Again, this ensures the operating system will automatically execute it. And when the malware is persisted and executes, what it does is it executes something called MS helper, which we can observe that being created and executed. And we can see it's executed with various command line arguments. For example, Mac CPU usage, CPU priority. Again, there's this XMR, blah, blah, blah. So all this is an XMR miner that, again, the attacker is installing on as many Mac systems as they can in order to mine cryptocurrency to make the hacker money. Again, from a purely unethical point of view, not a bad idea. You can infect 100,000 Macs and have them all mine cryptocurrency for you. Maybe you can retire to Hawaii. I don't know. Next up, we have Dummy. This is a piece of malware. Another piece of malware I named. Again, the reason it's called Dummy is because it's fairly dumb. The first thing about it that's rather dumb is in order to infect users, what the hackers would do would be to actually message people on Slack channels with commands to run in order to infect themselves. So this is like next level social engineering. You're basically like IMing people like, hey, run this command. And some users, I guess, do. And if they run the command, it'll like infect the malware. There's really nothing you can do to block this kind of attack. I mean, and if users are running arbitrary commands from strangers on the internet, it's like, well, I don't know. I think they deserve to be infected. In terms of persistence, again, it persists as a launch daemon. We can see the launch daemon file, calm.startup.plist. Run it load is set to true, and it executes something called script.sh. If you're wondering, yes, block will detect this persistence. In terms of its capabilities, it's an interactive backdoor, so that's kind of neat. We noted it persists something called script.sh, which will be re-executed every time the system is rebooted. And if we look at what that script does, we can see that it's a Python snippets or execute some Python code, which will connect out to a command and control server at 185.blah on port 1337, which I think is kind of funny. And then what it does is it invokes the OS dupe 2, which will duplicate the standard in, out, and error handlers to basically this command. So what that means in layman's terms is that they're basically spawning a shell, an interactive shell, and because they have set the socket connection to standard in, standard out, whenever the hacker types something remotely, that will get piped into the shell, and any response that goes to standard out will get redirected back to the socket and sent back to the attacker. So this is a very simple interactive shell. Of course, with an interactive shell, a remote interactive shell, you can run any commands. It gives you like full access, remote access to the system. So you can start processes, exfiltrate files. It's unknown what this malware specifically was doing. If I had to guess, since it was targeting cryptocurrency admins, it was probably trying to steal cryptocurrency. Again, most malware is driven by money. Next up, we have Callisto. Callisto is interesting because it's perhaps a precursor to another piece of Mac malware called Proton. And it's a persistent backdoor that enables remote login and screen sharing. Some write-ups. Kaspersky was the AV company that originally detected that. So again, kudos to them. What it does is, this is kind of funny, it basically spreads itself in a fake infected disk image, which is made to look like Indigo's Mac Internet Security. So Josh, I'm sure you kind of laugh and cringe at this at the same time. This, again, has nothing to do with Indigo. The attackers basically said, hey, this is a popular application. Let's make a fake disk image using these icons and then try to get users to install that, either maybe via email or perhaps uploading this malicious application to file sharing documents. It's not signed, which is not too surprising. Of course, the legitimate Indigo disk image would be. In terms of persistence, it's a launch agent. Nothing too surprising here. And in terms of its capability, it's a backdoor. So the first thing that happens when the malware executes, it's going to display a fake authentication prompt. So you might be familiar with authentication prompts on macOS. And normally the way those worked are those are displayed by the system. So even if there's a piece of malware on your system, it cannot gain access to your password. Now, there's nothing preventing a piece of malware on your system to create a window that looks exactly like the authentication prompt. And when you put in your password and click OK, it's going to save that. And that's exactly what it does. So specifically, it saves it to something called cred.dat. So you can look for this file on your system. Not going to be there unless you happen to be infected with this malware, which I doubt you are. But if you dump this file on an infected system, you will see the user's username and the password. So here is the username, and here is the password. Just going to post this link again in case you want to follow along. So there's two main goals of Callisto, and that's to exfiltrate user information and then also enable remote access. So this is, again, more likely a cyber espionage type of malware that's perhaps used by nation states versus, adware, right? So we can see what it does is it, for example, zips up the keychain and exfiltrates that to the command and control server. It also grabs things like your Google cookies, your Chrome cookies, and history. So again, this is obviously very interesting perhaps to nation states or governments who are trying to spy on Mac users. It also enables remote access by enabling the remote logging and activating Apple's remote desktop agent called ARD agent. So this provides the attacker full remote access via the remote desktop. Kind of interesting. Next up, we have Apple Juice, kind of a creative name. This is a persistent downloader that was targeting cryptocurrency companies. I believe it was tied to the North Koreans. The North Koreans, and this isn't proven, so maybe don't quote me on this, but basically what this the North Koreans did, my theory is, that there was a lot of sanctions placed against North Korea. So in order to fund their activities, perhaps developing weapons of mass destruction, they obviously need money. One way to get money, if there's a lot of sanctions on your company, is cryptocurrencies. So they hacked a lot of banks and cryptocurrency exchanges, allegedly. And so in this scenario, what the likely North Koreans did was actually create an entire fake company and then message people basically saying, hey, here's a new software that we have created that can be used to manage and trade cryptocurrencies. So yeah, Celis Trade Pro, I think was, or Celis Limited was the fake company they created, fake website and everything. So then they emailed all these cryptocurrency companies and basically said, hey, will you try out our new trading application? And some fell for it. So kind of creative, kind of interesting. Its main goal was to basically execute additional logic by downloading different stuff. So when it ran, it would execute something called updater. And in the background, that would reach out to a URL and download something called var./zdiffsec. Now, I haven't got a copy of this file yet. I've asked Kaspersky, and fingers crossed, they'll hook me up. So I don't actually know what this second stage piece of software is, but my guess is it's probably a interactive backdoor, something that allows the attacker to run commands on the system. Again, the most interesting thing about this malware, again, is this persistence mechanism, which, again, whoever this was, likely North Koreans, set up this entire fake company and then built this fake cryptocurrency trading application, which works, but has this kind of built-in malicious component. So kind of interesting that they put that much time and effort into infecting Mac users. Next up, we had Wintail. Talked about this on the last live stream, so we'll breeze through this. Wintail is an interesting cyber espionage backdoor that was targeting individuals of a certain Middle Eastern government. It's kind of interesting, very targeted attack. The most interesting thing was the infection vector. Again, we talked about this in detail in a previous live stream, so I'm not going to go into that. You can look that up or, again, read more about this on the blog. In terms of its capabilities, we're going to talk about those today, so I'm going to kind of bounce over that. And then the last two malware samples we have for 2018. First is Evil Egg. Evil Egg is simply a dropper that installs other backdoors. Again, it accessed Mac systems or infected Mac users by installing coin ticker from a attacker controlled domain. So again, the attacker created a fake application that had some cryptocurrency capabilities and then basically tricked users into downloading this. If the users download it, they would then become infected with this application. So we can see really the trend of 2018 is like target all cryptocurrency users. Yeah, I guess that's was a good idea. In terms of persistence, a launch agent, nothing too surprising there. Block, again, will detect that capability. We can dump the plist file. One interesting about it is it has a dot at the beginning, which means that if you try to view this via Finder, it's not going to show up. But if you do it from the terminal, obviously the file will show up. So we can dump the contents of this file, and we can see, yes, run it load is set to true. And we can also see what they are persistent. Specifically, we can see that they are going to execute curl to download something, decrypt it, save it to temp info.py, and then run that. So it's likely that they're downloading some Python code. If we look at exactly what this Python is, we can see they're installing something called the eggshell backdoor, which is an open source Python backdoor. So in a nutshell, that's what this dropper does. Basically installs a open source Python backdoor so that a remote attacker can have arbitrary access to the system. And then finally, we have Fairytale. Fairytale is another downloader that simply installs adware on your system. So in terms of its infection vector, it's unknown, but it's likely something that requires user interaction. So it's probably something that the user is tricked into downloading. So the malware is distributed something called spellingchecker.app. Again, the users are probably, maybe tricked into download this by a web pop-up or an email. But again, it requires user interaction. Persistence is achieved via a launch agent. Some details on that. We can basically look at the property list file. We see the run at load key is set to true. And we can see they execute the persistent component called launch service D. Its capabilities, it's simply an adware installer, which to me is really not that exciting or interesting. It's just basically going to go out and download a crap load of adware onto an infected system. It does have some capabilities to detect if it's running in a VM, so that's kind of neat. If it's not in a VM, it will, again, as I mentioned, infect the system with a lot of adware. For example, Mac search, liquor search, just this annoying adware that's going to hijack search results, perhaps display pop-ups on the user system, which again, all generate revenue for the attacker. Oh, and I lied. We actually have one more piece of malware, Darth Minor. Darth Minor is a backdoor that leverages Empire and XMRig. Empire is an open source Python backdoor, and XMRig, we talked about earlier, is cryptocurrency miner. So this was kind of interesting because the way users would get infected with this specific piece of malware would be by downloading something called Adobe Z, which is designed to pirate other Adobe applications. So again, in this case, users kind of got what they deserved, maybe, because they were trying to download a pirated application, and it's unknown if the official Adobe Z pirated. Can you have official pirated apps? Well, you get what I'm saying. I'm not sure if the attacker made a copy of the pirated app and injected their own malware. It's probably what happened. But again, when the user would execute what they thought was the legitimate Adobe pirated application, they would instead get something that would infect the system. So as you can see, it does two things. It installs the Empire Python backdoor and then the XMRig crypto miner. Self-explanatory. Going to basically give the attacker remote access to the system and also, why not, mine cryptocurrency. So the question is environment detection unique? Verifying if it's running in a VM. That's an excellent question. First, what is a VM? VM is a virtual machine. It's basically something where you can have a virtual instance of, for example, Mac OS running kind of in this safe environment. So you can just run any malware you want, let it do whatever it wants. It's not going to infect your actual system. So this is what malware analysts, as myself, do. In the next part of this live stream where we analyze Windtail, we will do that analysis in a VM. Again, it's always good to do back malware analysis in a VM if you're running the malware, because if you run it and it infects the VM, you can just wipe the VM at the end, restore it. It's really, it's like analyze it in a lab in a sandbox. It's not going to infect your files. Malware authors know this, so a lot of times what they do is they will check if they're running in a VM, and if they're not running in a VM, they will simply, if they are running in a VM, they will simply exit or do something non-malicious, because they say, generally rightly so, the only reason that they are running in a virtual machine is if someone is analyzing them. So if you're running Mac malware, this is not a bad idea. However, it is a decent detection heuristic, because I'm looking at a file that I'm not sure is malicious or benign, and I see if it's looking looking to detect if it's running in a VM and has separate logic if it's running in a VM versus not. This is something that you don't normally see in legitimate software. So it's kind of like a reddish flag that this is something that is suspicious. Now, there's a million ways to determine if you are running in a VM. What they do here is they basically execute the ioreg command with the -L, and they pipe that into grep to see if there's any of these strings, VirtualBox, VMware, Parallel. So I believe I have a VM, so we can actually try this. See what happens. I think they piped it into grep VMware. And you can see, yeah, it detects a lot of VMware type things. Virtual USB, keyboard, blah, blah, blah. So that's one way. So if I come to my dev box and run that same command, okay, this is actually interesting. I have likely VMware's kernel extension installed on my dev box so that it can talk to my VM, so I can do things like drag and drop. So in this case, the malware would actually think it's running on a VM, but would exit. So it actually wouldn't infect my system. But again, this is probably a good thing because in this case, the malware won't run even on native hardware if that native hardware has VMware, for example, Fusion installed, which probably is a good thing because most users that have virtual machines may be malware analysts anyways. So again, kind of an interesting technique. There's a lot of other ways you can look for, I think the host name for VM, we see, I think it's like uname-a. No, what is that? Host. I have no idea what I'm doing here. There are a bunch of other things in a VM that you can detect programmatically. Serial number, I think a MAC address is another one. For example, there's certain MAC addresses that are associated with VMs. So what malware will do is it will basically look for certain MAC address ranges. If one of those ranges falls within VMware, they know they're running in a VM. Now you can bypass all this stuff. So if you're analyzing malware and it's not running in your VM, or you see it has, for example, some logic, system profiler, oof, this gonna work. I forget the exact command for that. But yeah, if you're analyzing some malware and you see it basically looking for this kind of stuff, for example, the MAC address, you can, yeah, let me try that command. You can basically, for example, change the MAC address. Yeah, so I think there's like grep VM. I'll do one more thing. Let's see, VMware in site objective-c.com, because I think I blogged about this. There was another piece of malware that basically had that. I'll do a quick search here. I'll probably look this up later. Okay, well, abort on that. But there was another piece of Mac adware that would look for the MAC address, and it could recognize basically VMware MAC addresses. So it wouldn't run. Again, the whole goal was not to run in a VM because it assumed that an adversary, or sorry, a malware analyst is going to be running the VM. So again, this is kind of interesting that Mac adware has this. Something we're probably going to see more of. Okay, so the last piece of Mac malware for the year, just make sure that there's not another one after this, yeah, is Lamepire. And again, we talked about this in another live stream, so I'm not going to go into details. But basically, it's again, the infection vector is a fake application that users have to manually download and run, persists as a launch agent, and once it's persisting, it installs a Python script that installs a well-known backdoor, Empire, and then also another binary that continually takes screen captures and then exfiltrates them. So that allows the attacker to spy on that. So that is a wrap. That was kind of a marathon, but that was all the new, publicly discussed, new Mac malware of 2018. So if you're interested in that, again, here's the link for the blog. There's a PDF of that I posted somewhere. Downloads/Mac malware. This is not going to work. 2018 update. I don't remember though. Yeah, totally not. Good. No. I posted it on Reddit. Reddit.com/malware. What? Oh, bah. Should be more prepared for my. I really like the old version of Reddit. Yeah, I posted the PDF somewhere around here. Here we go. Woo woo, woohoo! Ah, I was close. Mac malware of 2018. So if you want to read that PDF, it's just a nice printout. It is 48 pages, so maybe read it on your next plane ride. But again, my goal was really to articulate all in one place all the Mac malware of 2018, describing the infection vectors, providing links to more detailed write-ups, to describing the persistence mechanisms, and then also the capabilities of the